Late on a rainy Saturday evening in Chicago, my entire world shattered because of an old silver band sitting on my left wrist. I was at an upscale charity dinner packed with decorated officers and local politicians, sipping sparkling water and trying to look like I belonged. An elderly, silver-haired man wearing full military dress uniform approached me from across the polished room. He was staring directly at my wrist with an intense, haunting gaze, his eyes wide with utter shock. He didn't introduce himself, nor did he ask for my name, but instead reached out with trembling fingers to turn my arm toward the chandelier light. The moment he read the tiny, obscure symbols etched deep into the metal, every bit of color drained completely from his face, and he gripped my arm as if he had just witnessed a ghost standing right in front of him. He looked up at me with raw terror and asked where on earth I had gotten that piece of silver. I told him softly that it belonged to my grandmother who had passed away alone in a rural hospital 6 weeks prior. The general lowered his voice to a low, heavy whisper and urged me to step into a private hallway immediately. In that quiet corridor, away from the clinking champagne glasses and laughing crowds, I realized the quiet old woman my family had ignored for decades was a complete lie. My grandmother, Clara Vance, had lived in a tiny, falling-down house at the end of a dirt road near Oak Creek, Illinois. She was a woman who worked as a simple seamstress, or at least that was the story my parents always told me whenever I asked about her past. Growing up, my parents always treated Grandma Clara like a massive disappointment who had accomplished nothing with her life. My mother used to sigh at family dinners and complain that Clara lacked any real ambition or drive to make something of herself. My father would just roll his eyes whenever her name came up, claiming she was just a simple woman who preferred her dull, lonely routine. They almost never visited her, letting holidays pass by without ever offering to drive the 2 hours downstate to check in on her. Whenever I called her from college, she always sounded so surprised and gentle, telling me not to waste my precious time worrying about an old woman. I let myself believe my parents' narrative, assuming she was just a quiet soul who wanted to be left entirely alone in her small town. When her health suddenly failed last month, nobody in my immediate family bothered to drop what they were doing to help. My mother assumed it was just a minor cold, my father said the local doctors had it under control, and my brother ignored the text messages entirely. I was working a grueling 12-hour shift as an emergency room nurse when a neighbor finally called my personal phone. She told me Clara had collapsed on her kitchen floor and that nobody from our family was answering the hospital calls. I drove through a blinding rainstorm that drove night, my chest squeezing tighter with every mile as guilt washed over me. When I finally reached her small hospital room, she was hooked up to noisy monitors, looking impossibly small under the white industrial blankets. She smiled weakly when I walked into the room, telling me gently that I should not have driven all that way in bad weather. I grabbed her cold hand and promised her that my parents were on their way, but she just shook her head with a sad, knowing look. She told me not to be upset with them because some people only show up for the parts of life they can understand. I did not grasp the weight of her words until much later, after she passed away quietly in her sleep 3 days later. My parents sent a generic store-bought floral arrangement to the funeral home, while my brother texted a quick apology about his busy work schedule. Only 4 people attended the service, including myself, the local pastor, and a mysterious woman in dark sunglasses who slipped away before I could speak to her. After the burial, I drove to her quiet house to pack up her few earthly belongings before my parents put the land on the market. In a dusty wooden box hidden deep behind her old sewing machine, I discovered the heavy silver bracelet tucked beneath leftover spools of thread. The band was worn smooth, but the inside held a series of precise, micro-engraved military codes that clearly were not decorative. I remembered her wearing it during my childhood, always tucked beneath long sleeves, once telling me it was a reminder of who she used to be. I put the bracelet on my wrist that day simply to feel connected to her, having no idea that wearing it to a public event would explode my entire family's reality. Back in the quiet hallway of the charity event, General Arthur Vance stared at the engraved symbols on my wrist and took a deep, shaky breath. He pulled a small notebook from his formal coat, rapidly jotting down my grandmother's full legal name and my personal phone number. He leaned in close and whispered that the band on my wrist was never meant to be seen by civilians, promising to call me the next morning. I drove back to my apartment with my heart pounding against my ribs, unable to shake the overwhelming feeling that my entire life had been built on a lie. When I called my mother late that night to ask about Clara's early life, she laughed off my questions, insisting Grandma was just an ordinary seamstress who bought cheap jewelry at flea markets. My father was equally dismissive when I brought it up the following afternoon, telling me I was just overcomplicating a simple woman's memory out of grief. But 2 days later, an encrypted email arrived in my inbox requesting an urgent, private meeting at an unmarked office building outside the city. I drove to the location without telling my parents, finding General Vance waiting for me in a stark, windowless room with 2 classified intelligence files on his desk. He looked me in the eyes and revealed that Clara Vance was never just a seamstress in a forgotten small town. During the height of the Cold War, she was a high-level covert communications operative embedded deep inside the Midwest to manage secret intelligence networks. The general explained that her small sewing shop was actually a brilliant front used to receive, decode, and pass critical encrypted messages between field agents. Her entire quiet lifestyle, her modest house, and her distance from the family were all part of a carefully constructed cover story designed to protect everyone around her. The silver bracelet was a specialized identification piece given only to top-tier operatives whose contributions were far too dangerous to ever appear on official public records. General Vance told me with absolute seriousness that my grandmother had saved dozens of lives during her decades of active service through her total silence and unbreakable discipline. Hearing him describe her bravery sent tears streaming down my face as I thought about how my parents had mocked her for being useless. The general handed me a faded, handwritten letter that Clara had left in her classified file, specifically addressed to whichever family member was brave enough to seek out the truth. In her tight, elegant handwriting, she wrote that she never regretted serving her country, though it broke her heart that her children viewed her as a failure. She wrote that she chose to accept their harsh judgment and isolation because keeping them in the dark was the only way to keep them completely safe from her hidden world. Reading her final words tore through my heart, knowing she had carried the heavy burden of our family's contempt all the way to her quiet grave. The very next evening, I gathered my parents and my brother at their house, placing Clara's original handwritten letter directly onto the dining room table. I watched my mother's face turn ghost white as she read her mother's words, her hands trembling so violently that the paper rattled in her grip. My father stood frozen by the doorway as I explained my meeting with the general and laid out the declassified files detailing Clara's extraordinary sacrifices. My brother dropped his head into his hands, remembering all the times he had ignored her phone calls and refused to help her with simple house repairs. The thick, uncomfortable silence in the room was suffocating as the harsh reality of their arrogance finally crashed down upon them. My father sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the floor with tears running down his weathered cheeks as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He admitted aloud that he had spent his entire adult life judging his mother by her simple clothes and quiet house, entirely blind to the hero standing right in front of him. My mother wept openly, clutching the letter to her chest as she confronted the painful truth that her mother had sacrificed her own reputation to keep her family safe. They had spent decades treating her like an embarrassing afterthought, never bothering to ask a single meaningful question about her past or her inner world. A week later, our family traveled back to the small cemetery in Oak Creek, but this time we were not standing alone in the rain. General Vance arrived in full military attire alongside a small detail of uniformed officers who presented my family with an official, private commendation for Clara's secret service. Standing by her headstone as the wind blew through the trees, my parents finally understood the true depth and strength of the woman they had so carelessly written off. I looked down at the silver bracelet gleaming on my wrist, feeling a profound sense of pride and heartbreak intertwined within my soul. Clara Vance lived in the shadows so that we could live in the light, leaving behind a powerful legacy that taught me to never measure a person's worth by the quiet life they choose to live.